We're working our way through the major prophets, and we've come to Ezekiel. Isaiah's big message is Yahweh saves, and he shows us God's great plan and what he's going to accomplish through the Messiah. Jeremiah gives us insight into the new covenant and how God is going to send the Spirit and enable his people to obey and really be what he designed them to be. Ezekiel you could describe as a theologian of glory, or the theologian of God's presence. Ezekiel is one of the most difficult books in the Bible for most of us, I would think. And for some, it might just be the most difficult book in the Bible to understand. And I can totally appreciate that myself. They say Jewish rabbis wouldn't let people read it until they were over 17 because it's just so challenging. And yet it's important. It helps us understand the New Testament Ezekiel. There are concepts in Ezekiel that are pretty exciting, actually. You have Jesus as the Good Shepherd. You have the New Covenant. You have the fact of God's people, the reality of God's people being his temple. In fact, we say we can have a personal relationship with God, and that's pretty special in what it tells us about God and God's plans for his relationship with us. Ezekiel's the one who helps us understand this idea of a personal relationship with God. And that's huge. Now, obviously, if you're coming to Ezekiel with a selfish attitude, like, what do I do right now? What job should I sign up for? Or something like that. It's going to be a hard book. You can imagine if you do this with Ezekiel, the way some people read the Bible. What do I do? How do I do this? Imagine Ezekiel says, lay on your side for 390 days. Okay, how am I going to apply that? That's a long time. But if you step back, Ezekiel is dealing with big picture issues. It's telling a story, and it's helping us understand the story of what God is doing in the universe. And that's huge. While there are many themes throughout the book, one major theme has to do with God's presence and God's relationship with his people, his special presence. You remember back in the Garden of Eden, this is the way things were supposed to be. We're supposed to be able to commune with God and enjoy God's presence. But Eden's lost. And man is cast out of God's presence. And then God keeps seeking to make a way for man to enjoy his presence. So you have the tabernacle, and then you have the temple, and the glory of God coming down to dwell with man. But then the temple's going to be lost. Ezekiel tells this story of how the temple is going to be lost. And the people hearing that, coming from Ezekiel, couldn't believe that the temple would be lost, because the temple wasn't just the temple. It represented Eden. It represented the presence of God. It represented the whole plan of God to dwell with his people. The temple is incredibly significant. Exodus 33, verse 3, Israel sins, and God says, I'm going to let you enter the promised land, but I won't be with you. And Moses says, no, if you're not with us, we don't want it. What makes us unique and important is your presence. And so God says, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And Moses says, this is what makes us special, basically. It's your presence. And then God has Moses build a tabernacle so he can move in, and that tabernacle becomes the temple. And this is what makes Israel, Israel. God's presence. You, O Lord, are in the midst of us, Jeremiah 14:9. And now it looks like it's going to be gone, which is tragic. And yet Ezekiel is about how God's going to do something much bigger and better than a garden, or even simply the temple as they had experienced it. The plan is bigger. That's basically what Ezekiel's saying. And so the first 32 chapters of Ezekiel are very dark, and they have to be. It feels like God's presence is lost. But those first 32 chapters set us up for the second half, 33 through 48, which is the good news. Bad news, good news. But it has to start out dark, because Israel just cannot believe the temple's going down. That is too hard for them to process, because they didn't think of themselves as being as sinful as previous generations, and because of the ways they had interpreted certain promises. They had these 4 major promises that they thought meant they would never lose the temple. One is the promise of the land, God's connection to the land, and God's giving them the land. The second was the covenant, the way they were interpreting the covenant. They thought that meant God would never send them into exile or take away his presence. The kingship covenant, the Davidic covenant, was another promise that they thought we can pretty much do anything we want. And then, of course, the fact that they had the temple. Jeremiah 7, if you remember, when Jeremiah came and he was preaching exile to them and judgment to them in front of the temple, they had a song they were singing. They're like, the temple, the temple, the temple. That was their get out of jail free card, you might say. And it's all getting stripped. God's taken the land away. He's explaining the covenant wasn't just about blessings. It also had curses. I'm going to keep that part of the covenant because you're not listening. Their kings are getting worse and worse and worse, and eventually they just have a governor. And as each one is being stripped away, they're like, no, 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 no. At least we have the temple. And Ezekiel's like, you're not going to have that much longer. But let's start by looking at the man. Who is Ezekiel? The book is about the glory of God, the presence of God. But who is Ezekiel? Who's the author? His name. He's not mentioned in the Old Testament outside of this book. And his name, you know how the prophets, their names usually represent what their book is about. His name either represents an affirmation of faith. It could mean God strengthens, God toughens. And you could see why he would need that personally. Or it could be an appeal to faith. May God strengthen, may God toughen. And that could be part of what he's crying out to the people. His family background, he was the son of Buzi, the priest. Apparently he belonged to the upper echelons of society in Jerusalem, at the group that was taken away into Babylon in the second deportation in 597 BC. You remember Judah was sent into exile in 3 waves. 605, you have Daniel and his group going. 597, Ezekiel and that group going. And then 586, everybody else except for very poor people and Jeremiah. We don't know where he lived before he was taken to Babylon, but most likely he was born in 623 BC. We think this is true because the book begins by saying, in the 30th year. 30th year of what? Probably the 30th year of his life. The book basically begins on Ezekiel's birthday. Now, that means he was born in the midpoint of Josiah's reign. And what happened during Josiah's reign? Josiah was one of the godliest kings Judah ever had, if not the godliest. And there was a great revival, a kind of revival that took place during the reign of Josiah. You remember how they even rediscovered the book of the law. Ezekiel's name may represent the optimism of his parents. They were learning God's law. They're in the middle of a revival, and they have this child, and they give him a name that tells everyone where to put their hope. Hope in God. God can give us the strength we need. This name ends up being very appropriate for him, however, if you think about the kings that come after Josiah and the difficulties Ezekiel had to endure. One of the most obvious difficulties Ezekiel had to endure was the fact that instead of being able to serve out his normal course as a priest, he was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar with other exiles back to Babylon. And we're going to see why that was so hard, especially for Ezekiel. His personal life. Ezekiel was married. His wife died right in the middle of his ministry, basically. We see a little bit about her death in chapter 24. This was a number of years into his ministry already, and as we read Ezekiel, we'll see that the first phase of his ministry was carried out from his home, which means this woman had a very difficult job, especially as we look at the way Ezekiel was asked to carry out his ministry. She would have had to be very patient with her husband. She could never predict what he was going to do next. She had to be hospitable as many people came to just watch Ezekiel. Much of the time, she couldn't even have a conversation with him, actually, because he wasn't allowed to talk about everyday things. The only time he could speak was when God opened his mouth, Ezekiel 3, verse 26. What was Ezekiel like, his personality? He has to act a bit like a nut, actually. There was one time when he had to shut himself within his house and be bound with cords. There was another time when he had to lie on his left side for 390 days. And then when that was done, he had to lie on the other side for 40 days. There was another time when he basically had to go around and live like he was a homeless person. There was still another time when he had to go out among the people and just groan and cry until things became very awkward, and they started asking him why he was groaning and crying. And then when his wife died, he wasn't allowed to cry, and he had to act like everything was normal. Some people, obviously, they read that and they look at Ezekiel and they ask, what's wrong with this man? But obviously, the things I just described weren't actually about Ezekiel's personality, but instead they were part of him being faithful to God's call and God's commands. Ezekiel was a man who was controlled by the Spirit of God. That's important to understand about Ezekiel. He, in a sense, becomes the temple. He was chosen to serve as a kind of sign to the people to whom he was ministering. In other words, he wasn't simply prophesying through what he said. His life was to be a kind of prophecy. God was saying something through what Ezekiel did. His ministry. No one responded to his message positively. I mean, at least Jeremiah had Baruch. Ezekiel has nobody. They come to him for entertainment. They're like, what do you want to do tonight? Let's go watch Ezekiel. But they don't care about his message. They come for a show. There isn't a hint of positive response in the book. But guess what happens? 538, 539, Cyrus issues a decree, just like the prophet said he would, go home and rebuild the temple. And what happened? How many people went home? Ezra gives us some numbers. About 42,000 people went home. Where did these people come from? In 597, Ezekiel and his compatriots were dragged into exile. In 539, 50,000 or so from Babylon go home in faith. Where did they come from? I think they probably, when these events were happening, knew that they had heard from a prophet, and it dawned on them, yes, the Lord's message is true. Let's listen to Ezekiel. We don't know how Ezekiel's life ended, but he could have taken some comfort in that, yes, there was some fruit from his labor. All those years didn't go wasted. If you think about it, some have said Ezekiel's life was a pretty lonely life, actually. There isn't a hint in this book of anyone helping him besides maybe his wife, I guess. He can't even really talk about converts. God calls us to faithfulness. He doesn't call us to success. The fruit of one's labors is God's business. The labor is our business. This is our response of faithfulness. Specifically, God called Ezekiel to preach messages of judgment to Judah. Because they wouldn't listen, God made Ezekiel do strange things to help them see that this judgment was coming. And after that judgment came, God explained through Ezekiel that hope was not lost and how he would rescue and recreate them in a shocking and dramatic way. Now, background. That's the man and his ministry. But background, what was going on when Ezekiel was serving God as a prophet? Ezekiel was a prophet primarily during the exile. You remember how there are prophets who come before the exile, prophets who prophesied during the exile, and then prophets who are after the exile. Ezekiel's a prophet during the exile from 593 BC to 571 BC. At this time, Jews are having to live in several different places. There are some in Judah, there are some in Egypt, and there are some in Babylon. The Jews in Judah were basically the poorest of the land. Of the few that were left, some had already fled to Egypt. In general, the people that remained had it difficult financially, spiritually, and physically, actually just like God had said. In Ezekiel, we discover that the scum rises to the top. Once again, there were a few left in Israel. They were suffering, but they still were proud and arrogant. We see in Ezekiel 11:15 that the people back home are saying about the ones who have been exiled, you are far from Yahweh, the land is ours, we are favored by God, that's why we're still here. We're the people of God. The others are obviously rejected, or they would not have been taken into exile, which is the opposite of what Jeremiah had to prophesy. The Egyptian Jews, so those are the Jews in Judah, they're poor and proud. The Egyptian Jews, in Jeremiah 44:1, we see there were Jewish settlements in Egypt, and that's where Jeremiah was taken, you remember, and then eventually killed. And they ended up becoming pretty syncretistic. They just sort of tried to mesh a lot of different things together from where they were in Egypt and from where they were back home. Then there were the Babylonian Jews, and Ezekiel's primary audience were the Jews that were living in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar had brought the cream of the crop and settled them nearby to break down the bonds of nationality and resistance, to destroy political structures so that he could provide men for his army and to bolster the economy. It was his plan to bring people from the countries he conquered. Those were some of the reasons why he did that. His policies were different than the Assyrians. When God takes care of the northern kingdom, he brings in the Assyrians who scatter the northern kingdom, and then they bring foreigners in to settle the north. That was their policy. The Assyrians' goal was to make the people they captured one big group. And so they would there would be a lot of assimilation of their people. But what would have happened if they had done that to Judah? It's not accidental that it was the Babylonians who took care of Judah, because the Babylonians had a different policy. They took them into exile in Babylon, and then they would settle all the Jews together in one place. The Assyrians would have them live in different places among different people. But the Babylonians had all the people they captured live in one place together. They didn't scatter them. They didn't destroy Judean self-identity. They settled them as a colony. And when it's time for the Judeans to come back home, there's a different empire on the throne. There's the Persians. And their policy was to keep the gods of the people happy, so they said, go home and build temples to your gods. Jehoiachin was dragged off to Babylon, but seems to have fared well in Babylon. He was described as the king of the land of Judah. Even when he's in exile, he receives rations from the storehouses. We don't really know why he was treated well, except God's mercy to the descendant of David. Ezekiel's ministry, though, focused on one specific community, Tel Aviv by the river Kebar. This was basically Judahville, little Judah, down next to Babylon. It's almost like you can imagine this as a refugee camp for Jews. Many Jews were actually beginning to do fairly well in Babylon, just as God said. The Judean exiles didn't actually suffer financially. Some rapidly rose to the top and quickly got involved in the economics of the country. And this is why when Cyrus issued the decree to go home, many didn't even go home. Most Jews preferred to stay in Babylon because it was a lot better living in Babylon than in Jerusalem. And this sets the stage for that sort of division that you find in the New Testament between Jews who are Hellenized and very Greek, and then Jews who are very Jewish, like the Pharisees. But many Jews were living all over the world at the time of the New Testament, and this is partly why. They weren't suffering in Babylon. This wasn't slavery. This actually turned out not to be an economic hardship for them. Emotional hardship, for sure, but this is not economic hardship. They seem to have done quite well. How is it that they did so well? Daniel. When these Judeans came, Daniel was already in a position of power, and I think he said, I'll settle these folks, and he settled them in a Goshen-type area like Joseph had done in Egypt. The problem with the Babylonian Jews was not economic, it was theological, and Ezekiel primarily addresses that. This is the key to the whole book of Ezekiel, as I think it's Daniel Block says. What do you say to a people who think their God has died? That's the question of Ezekiel. You see, in their minds, there was an inseparable bond between the land and God. So the fact that Judah had been taken from the land meant, in many people's minds, that their God had died. In the ancient world, this is just how people thought. They thought there was a relationship between the God and the land. So there were gods who were committed to certain parts of the world, to certain regions, and they protected the people who lived in that region. One of the big differences, that's probably why Naaman, by the way, took that land, that dirt, back with him, because that's how he thought, I'm going to take the land back with me, because now this is the God I worship. One of the big differences between the Israelite understanding of how their God's relationship with the land was, biblically, God established a relationship with the nation before he established a relationship with the land. And the land itself was a gift to the people. And throughout the rest of the world, they thought of it differently. So in Babylon, their god, Marduk, didn't care who the Babylonians were. Anybody who lived in Mardukville was supposed to worship Marduk, and Marduk took care of them. So when Cyrus conquers Babylon, he takes care of the temple of Marduk. The gods were extensions of royal powers where their territories were defined geographically rather than by people group. In Israel, it was the complete opposite. He promised the land, but Abraham was God's before the land ever was. So Judah had some confidence that God was going to take care of them based on the unusual relationship he had entered into with them. More specifically, their confidence in Yahweh was founded on a series of promises that he had made to the nation. Ezekiel was intended, however, to dismantle some of their hopes because they weren't really actually understanding the commitments God had made to them accurately. So they in the book of Ezekiel thought the temple would never be destroyed and that they were secure because God had made a covenant with them, and they assumed there could be no divorce, forgetting that actually part of that covenant required things of them. And one of Ezekiel's tasks is to announce, look, by your persistent rebellion, you have forfeited the benefits that came from this covenant. You don't get the blessings, you get the curses. Then they believed Yahweh was committed to that land, and they saw that land, Canaan, as being given to them as an eternal possession, and they thought Yahweh had to defend his territory, but Ezekiel is insisting that God is handing the land over to the foreigners, and that's why when they're dragged off, the people staying back said to those in exile, go far from Yahweh. The Lord's giving us the land. The city Jerusalem, they thought God had a special relationship with Jerusalem specifically, and Ezekiel's message is that God's prepared to leave his home. And then, of course, there's just the Davidic covenant, as we mentioned before, and they thought, well, God promised a king, that a king would always rule from David, and even if Jehoiachin ends up getting deposed, Yahweh is going to raise up another king. And so these were symbols of their security and why it was really hard for them to hear what Ezekiel was saying. Maybe a picture of what this is like. If you're in a relationship with someone and they said, I want you to go to the other side of the world where there's no Wi-Fi and no email, and I don't want a connection with you, and they push you out the door and they say, here's your taxi, leave now. You're like, what? What's going on? That's going to be hard to process. And that's kind of what's happening to Israel. They thought, we have the land, we have this covenant, we have the temple, we have the Davidic promise, and then it's all being stripped away from them. And they're like, whoa. Does God hate? What's going on? Has God died? And so even as Nebuchadnezzar's armies were coming closer and closer, they're hanging on to these four ideas as their hope. And yet, according to the prophet who's already in exile, he says the promises of God offer no security for those who aren't taking the covenant seriously. There's no security for those living in sin. That's Ezekiel's burden. Because Israel's in revolt, God is relieved of all obligations. And in fact, as a result, God himself is going to become the nation's enemy. And when all this happens, it's happening in the book of Ezekiel, and then it happens. He's telling them it's going to happen, and then it happens, and they're saying, no, it's not going to happen, but then it happens. And it creates all these theological problems for the people, because they were counting on these things, and now they're just confused. Nebuchadnezzar's victory left them emotionally devastated and caused so many questions about Yahweh. Where is God when you need him? It looked like Marduk had won, and Marduk was the primary deity of Babylon. Marduk is king was the mantra of the time. In our perspective, whoever has the biggest tank wins. In their day, whoever has the biggest God wins. So what do you say to a people who think their God has been defeated? The people were bitter, they were angry, they were shaken to the core, and in their minds, Yahweh had betrayed the people and he had gone back on his commitments. They were innocent victims. Ezekiel wanted to transform their perception of their relationship with God and give them a divine understanding of reality. This is Ezekiel's world. God ordains him to be a priest to the exiles. He's basically a priestly pastor. But how do you function as a priest without a temple? He serves as a pastor, and Ezekiel's role is not to bring sacrifices, but to pastor the people. And so he teaches the Torah. and he's rooting his messages in Moses. He keeps appealing back to what Moses had to say. And they might have wondered, has God forgotten his covenant? But really, Ezekiel wants them to understand that's missing the point. The fact is, God's covenant with Israel is the reason for what happened. On what grounds? Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. This is written into the stipulations of the covenant. If you persist in your rebellion, this has to happen. The promised blessings are replaced by the promised judgments, which were written into their very constitution. And yet, we're going to see that God allows this to happen, not because he's finished with the people and not because he's finished with the plan, but to push forward his great strategy, which is bigger and better than they could have imagined. And actually, in the middle of this judgment, we see he's created a way to keep the seed safe. It's like he creates Babylon as a kind of safe in order to protect the Davidic line while judging Judah for their rebellion against him. I mean, why didn't Nebuchadnezzar just kill Jehoiachin? Why? Because the Messiah has to come. And even as God is going to allow Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the temple, and God's going to leave the temple, it's going to be because as we continue to study the book of Ezekiel, God has an even bigger and better plan in mind, which we'll see in videos that follow.